So the title of the second presentation is How Did We Get Here? Was it by accident or by design? And the outline of tonight's talk is, firstly, it's important, very important in this question to have a definition of what we mean by our terms. What do we mean by evolution? What do we mean by creation? What is the evidence and the problems for those respective positions? What is the time question for those? And of course, does it really matter? What is the issue? What's the fuss all about? And then some conclusions. So that's where we're going to go tonight. So let's look at those topics of discussion. My Collins dictionary gave this as a definition of evolution: the origination of species by development from earlier, simpler forms of life over millions of years by the processes of natural selection and or mutation. Collins Dictionary. Creation, very, very simple. First page, first chapter, first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the first definition, no mention of God. In the second definition of creation, of course, God is paramount, the great architect, the great designer behind the universe that we see. So let's think about evolution. There is the evolutionary family tree showing descent from a common ancestor over millions of years. So we start from a single cell, and we branch out over millions of years into trees or into animals or into vertebrates, invertebrates, fish, birds, insects, and right somewhere near the top of the tree you can see a picture of man. Evidence cited in favour, of course, is that mutations over millions of years have favoured the creation or the coming into being of new structures which have then been acted upon by natural selection. And the fossil record gives proof of this process. As we look through the fossils, the millions and millions of fossils, we can see this process. And of course, there's some problems with this which we're going to look at tonight. It's fair to say that no one has observed experimentally any great changes in one group of organisms to another group of organisms. These things are assumed rather than demonstrated in the laboratory. Some of the evidence that's been cited in favour of the evolutionary model of origins has been shown to be mistaken, and some of it, unfortunately, has been fraudulent. We're going to look a little bit at that later on. And of course, if you do take a close look at the fossils, what you find is that whereas there should be a lot of transitional forms between one group of creatures and a supposed ancestor or different group of creatures that's developed from them, in fact you find that there's a large number of gaps in the fossil record, and that's widely recognized even by those who believe in the evolutionary model of origins. When we look at some of the organs of extreme perfection, like the eye, like the brain, like the ear, or even the hand or the knee, we find, in fact, it's extremely difficult. There's no consensus as to how these structures have formed over millions of years by what are essentially chance, random mutations acted upon by natural selection. And of course, the hardest thing for evolution to explain is not the development of the branches of the tree. That's difficult enough. But how we actually got to here. How did dead chemicals, upon which natural selection has no meaning for a selection of dead chemicals, natural selection only acts upon living things, how did we get to first base? How did life itself, with all its wonder and complexity, come about? How do we get life from non-life? Natural selection and mutation, of course, don't help at all to answer that question. And then we look at creation. And of course, the evidence, as we've already seen, wherever you look, through the microscope, through the telescope, you see design, evidence, strong evidence of design. Wherever you get information, wherever you get a message, you have an intelligent source. You have a messenger. You have someone behind every message, and that is true for the message that's coded in our genes as well, I would submit to you. The fossil record can easily and more convincingly, in my opinion, be interpreted in terms of a creation model followed by a worldwide catastrophic event, a mass extinction event. And we'll come back to that. And of course, Revelation. The ultimate proof of creation is that the Creator himself has come to visit the planet that he made. There are problems. And of course, some people will say, well, we just can't have creation because it's not naturalistic. It's not scientific, some might say. But actually, that is the wrong answer to the wrong question. It's not naturalistic. The question, is it true? That's what we need to decide. Not, is it naturalistic? Actually, for the ultimate origin of all things, even an atheistic scenario, a Big Bang scenario, is not naturalistic because that's not happening again and again, is it? So in other words, the idea that something isn't naturalistic is no objection to a serious consideration. So let's look a bit more closely, shall we, at evolution. Science is based upon observation and experiment. We call it the scientific method. And of course, Darwin himself said these words, not one change of species into another is on record. We cannot prove that a single species has been changed. We might like to discuss the meaning of species, but if we refer to one major group of animals, the point is very valid. There's not one change from one major group of animals to another group of animals. There's variation within a species. There's little dogs, big dogs, short dogs, white dogs, Chihuahuas and Great Danes, but they're all 100% dog. There's no record of a dog ever being anything other than a dog. And of course, we know that however long you leave it, you won't end up with a cat or a sheep or a monkey or anything like that. And that's the force of Darwin's quotation there. You say, what about natural selection? Well, that's true, of course. Natural selection is true. It's a fact. I don't know anyone who gainsays it, who says it's not true. But it's not the same as the evolution that was defined in my dictionary definition. And you say, well, what about mutations? Well, yes, they occur. Everyone admits those. There's nobody who denies them. But the point is this. They do not add any genetic information. They don't help the formation of feathers from scales. They don't help the formation of a limb if there's no genetic information to code for that limb. They don't help us to get these major barriers between one group of organisms and another that the evolutionary tree, the descent from common ancestry, demands. We've all done this one at school, perhaps. Maybe you didn't, but the peppered moth, one was a light variation, one was a dark variation. Both exist. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, the change brought about environmentally by clean air, by smog and so on, the birds were easily able to spot the variety of moth show up more clearly against the trees, and so one of the types of moths got eaten, and the white type of moth diminished. Of course, after the Clean Air Act in the 50s, when we started to reduce the pollution, then the black moth became a bit more visible, so that started to be fed upon by the predatory birds. And of course, we had, therefore, an example of natural selection. As the conditions changed, one of the moth varieties was favoured over the other, but then as the conditions changed back, the other one similarly was favoured again. And so the story is we had two moths to start with, we have two moths at the end, and we have a changing frequency of light or dark variety in the middle. Natural selection. But where's the evolution? How does that help us to get from A to B on the evolutionary family tree? Of course, the lack of fossil evidence has been known for many years. The missing links are still missing. Jay Gould, the famous paleontologist from Harvard, said this: "The family trees which adorn our textbooks are based on inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils." He is a believer in evolution, but he's saying he believes in it not because of all the transitional forms. He came up with another idea of evolution rather than base it upon the missing links which he accepted were missing. Punctuated equilibria was his theory. And of course, Darwin himself said this: "Firstly, why if species have descended from species by fine gradations, why do we not see everywhere innumerable transitional forms? This perhaps is the most serious objection to my theory." Darwin was honest enough to realize that there was a real problem with his Origin of the Species. He went on to believe it and to say, actually, as fossils and more will be discovered, the missing links will be found. And since that time, we've now billions of fossils, but the picture is still largely the same. And hence, Gould in 1977 came up with his theory. And of course, some of the evidence has been fraudulent. I always like to refer to Piltdown Man because it reminds scientists like myself of our fallibility. In 1912, a skull was found in a gravel pit in Piltdown in Sussex. The experts of the day, the world's best, were convinced that the missing link between apes and men had been found. 1953, so there's 41 years later, the Piltdown skull was dated using a method of fluorine dating, and it was found to have a human cranium, that's the top part of the skull, and found to have the jawbone of an orangutan, that's the lower part of the skull, and they'd been stuck together with plaster of Paris. The teeth were a bit long, and so someone had filed the teeth down, and you could see the file marks on the teeth. And of course, it was a deliberate fraud. Over 500 doctoral theses were written on Piltdown Man. A doctoral thesis, on average, takes 3 years to complete. That is a lot of man-years of wasted effort, is it not? Piltdown Man. And of course, there are other examples. This is one. There are other examples, particularly, of course, when it comes to the so-called common ancestor or missing link between apes and men. That was once you. It is, in fact, a single cell, and everyone has grown from a single cell, programmed by the DNA, the molecule of life in the nucleus. So you were once just like that, and so was I. But actually, there's no such thing as a simple cell. There's more atoms in a single cell than there are stars in the Milky Way. I've done the calculation. It's easy to do. Incredibly complicated. And we're told that it came by chance. That prompted Michael Denton, the molecular biologist, to write these words. Is it really credible that random processes, like mutation, could have constructed a reality, the smallest element of which, a functional gene or protein, is complex beyond our own creative capacities, which excels in every sense anything produced by the intelligence of man? If we can't make them, how can they come uncaused, undesigned, is the question. It is a big question. And of course, others have recognized it. The pen drive that contains these talks contains about 4 gigabytes of information, which is absolutely paltry compared to the information contained in your genome. The information storage medium with the highest known density is inside every one of you and inside me. Fred Hoyle, Nobel Prize winner, said these words: imagine 10 to the 50 blind persons. That's the solar system, shoulder to shoulder, full of blind men. You give them all a Rubik's Cube. Remember them? I couldn't do them with my eyes open. And all of these chaps arrive at the solved form by random shuffling, not looking what they're doing simultaneously. He said, you then have the chance of arriving by random shuffling, random variation, of just one of the many biopolymers upon which life depends. He said, this is nonsense. It's nonsense, he said, of a high order. You can't get life like that, as the atheistic naturalist would have to infer, because he can't believe in a designer in his worldview. He rules that out from the start. And of course, creation, wherever you look, there's design. Let's think about the watch illustration. You know the story, Paley's watch, walking along the common, he finds a watch in the heath, and he comes to the conclusion the watch must have had a maker. And that's a good conclusion. And even if he'd never seen a watch made, he still knows this must have had someone to have put it together. Even if the watch isn't working, he's still sound in his conclusion to say it must have had a maker. And even if he doesn't understand how it got together, he is still valid to make the conclusion the watch has a maker. He would be very, very surprised if he was told, well, the watch is nothing more than the results of the laws of metallic nature. They've produced the watch. He wouldn't believe you. If you told him there's no plan here, there's no design, it just happened, he wouldn't believe you. And of course, if that's true for a watch, what about you and me? A watch can't reproduce, but you and I, of course, can. Now, I don't know if there's any science fiction fans here in tonight's audience, but I like a little bit of science fiction. And of course, the SETI project, which stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has been looking for extraterrestrial intelligence for many years now. And the telescope, the radio telescopes, are pointed at the skies, listening for the signals that could come from other beings in outer space. And of course, we haven't heard anything yet. We haven't had any signals for the last 30 years, or at least since SETI began. Now, what would constitute a signal? Well, if you got a 2 and a 2 and a 4, that would constitute about 12 bytes of information. And that would be enough for some to postulate there's someone out there. Now, your DNA and mine has 4 billion bytes of information. How could that be an accident? Why are we prepared to conclude that a few, let's say 12 bytes or 24 bytes or 48 bytes of information would be enough to conclude intelligence somewhere out there, but we're not prepared to make that same conclusion when it comes to the DNA molecule? That's not being honest, is it? And of course, Revelation, the Bible claims to be the Word of God. It's inspired. It claims to be, it is completely self-consistent. It's infallible. Whichever way you measure it, it's been found to be true, historically, archaeologically, scientifically. It is without error. There are no proven errors in the Bible documents as they were originally given, and it's been fulfilled prophetically again and again. It contains 4 eyewitness accounts of the life of the Lord Jesus Christ, and Jesus spoke very definitely about creation. Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? When they asked Jesus about marriage, that is how he replied. He referred to the beginning book, Genesis, to establish teaching about marriage, which took place, of course, at the beginning of the creation. But what is the ultimate proof of creation? The ultimate proof is this: the Creator has visited the creation. Jesus Christ claimed to be God. C.S. Lewis has given us 3 alternatives to that statement. If Jesus claimed to be God, and he did, was he mad? That's what they thought at the time, some of them. Was he bad? Was he telling us lies? Or was he God? It would be a brave man, wouldn't it, a woman, to say that Jesus Christ was mad. I wouldn't dare say that. We question perhaps the honesty of someone who say that Jesus was bad. There's been very many wicked men in history. Jesus Christ is not one of them. He is credible in all that he does and says. He says things that only God can say. He said this, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Now that's outrageous if it's not true. Only he could say that. He did things that only God can do. He was able to control nature. He was able to walk on water. He was witnessed doing that. He was able to feed 5,000 men with a little boy's lunch. He created. Only God can do those sort of things. This wasn't sleight of hand. This was witnessed by thousands of people. He was able to give life. People were there when he stood in a graveyard and called a man who'd been dead 4 days to come from the tomb. And the people of the day, that was the reason they wanted to get rid of him, because they knew that everyone would believe in him. And of course that would upset the Romans and that would upset the order of the day. He did things that only God can do. He died, and 3 days later he rose from the dead. You might ask the question, and it has been asked many times, well, why did God become man? And of course the Bible gives us the answer to that question. Peter, the famous apostle who denied Jesus, said these words, Christ has once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God. Paul, the famous apostle, said these words, for he, Christ, became sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. Why did God become man? To do something that God in heaven could not do. Die a mortal death. God became man in order to die for our sins. That's the message of Christianity. The hymn puts it like this. Mrs. C.H. Alexander, concerned to be able to communicate to her Sunday school class the wonderful truths of Christianity, wrote these wonderful words. He died that we might be forgiven. He died to make us good, that we might go at last to heaven, saved by his precious blood. Why did God become man? In order to save man from his sin. Does it matter? Recognize him? Adolf Hitler. You see, what we believe about our origins affects our behavior. Charles Darwin wrote these words, at some future period not very far distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man, by which he meant mainly the white Caucasian races, such as ours mainly, will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races, by which he meant those who live in other parts of the world, in Africa and in Australia, the Aborigines and so on. That's what Darwin wrote. And of course, Hitler took it very seriously, didn't he? In his final solution, he appealed to evolution, evolutionary ideas, to justify his murder of over 6 million Jews who were from a different, inferior racial group to that of his Aryan race. It does matter, ladies and gentlemen, what we believe about origins. You say, well, why do so many believe it? Well, not everyone does. Of course, there's many scientists in the past and in the present. In 6 Days is a book that came out, a very interesting story behind it a few years ago of how 50 practicing scientists with PhDs or above say why they believe in the Genesis account. And of course, the Creation Research Society has over 700 scientists who would subscribe to a creation view of origins and not an evolutionary view. Many people have never considered the evidence. And of course, there is much scientific evidence which supports the biblical account. And of course, it must be said, some people are prejudiced. Richard Lewontin said these words: "No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." In other words, no matter what the evidence, I am not going to believe in God, is what he's saying. So what is the Christian answer? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There are serious scientific problems with the theory of evolution. The problems on a scientific level ought to be discussed in our schools and universities. I'm not saying that evolution shouldn't be taught. Far from that. I am saying that in science you must consider evidence for and against every theory. We do it with everything else. Why not evolution? The Christian answer is this. People say, well, if there is a, what's gone wrong with the world? Well, of course, the Bible gives the answer as well. Sin has entered the world. Through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin. The Bible picture is not millions of years of death and suffering to bring us to where we are today, but a perfect creation that fell into sin. And then death came as a consequence of it. That's what that verse teaches. And the final point. There is a missing link, and we all need it. It's the link that exists between man and God. Jesus Christ is the one who takes sinful creatures like us and puts us in contact with the one who loves us and sent his Son to die for us.